Hello everyone, this is a video about controlling the trim wheel in your flight simulator, specifically about Microsoft Flight Simulator 2020, but I think some of this could apply to others. And it's also specifically about helping those of us that have a digital trim wheel, which I'll talk about what that means in a minute, to get more responsiveness, more speed on the in-game trim wheel than we're getting, but also without sacrificing accuracy when we want it. So let's get started. This is a trim wheel in this particular Cessna Caravan, and I don't need to explain, I think, what the trim wheel does. This is the elevator trim specifically that I'm talking about, and it allows you to take pressure off the yoke or the stick to get level flight or a certain amount of climb or descent without having to be pushing on the yoke or the stick, which is important when you got a super strong spring like this Honeycomb Alpha does. You don't want to have to be holding that the whole time you're trying to fly level. So you use a trim wheel to trim out for what you want. So how do you move the trim wheel? There are multiple ways. Obviously, you have to give it some kind of input to tell it you want it to move. A way to move the trim wheel is to look down at it, get your mouse on it, and use your mouse scroll wheel. I can't really see my scroll wheel, but there it is. And now you scroll with your mouse button, and it moves a trim wheel. Difficulty with this is you're normally not looking at the trim wheel to see where your mouse is. And in VR, your mouse pointer kind of moves to where you're looking. So you get it on the trim wheel and you look away and it moves somewhere else. But you could do this. I just find it incredibly inconvenient. And also notice it is moving a big bunch on every mouse click. Probably somewhere that you could adjust that, but I don't know where it is. So I don't even count this ability to put the mouse over it and move the scroll wheel as a legitimate way in a real flight when you're trying to focus on other things to move the trim wheel, but it is a way. One way is with a button. So for instance, my gamepad controller here, my game controller has elevator trim up and down assigned to these point of view buttons. So I go back in the game, in the sim, and now I hit these buttons. Boom, 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 boom. You see the trim wheel moving. Not in a big hurry, but it's moving. One whatever per button press varies by plane. How much it's going to move and how much it's going to have an effect. Then I go the other way, right? And that would be annoying if that's all the faster you could do it, looking at how it's not even moving the indicator. But with a button, you can hold it down. And after a delay, then it starts moving faster. The delay is annoying if you're trying to get a feel for how much to trim while you're flying and you're not looking down at the trim wheel. But the delay has to be there because the sim doesn't know if you meant to do one button press and or hold it down. So it has to wait and see. It's like, did you just do one long button press? Because the last thing you want is when you do a button press, it interprets it as a hold down and you suddenly are flying. It's flying past where you want to set it. So, but that works. You've got a combination of very precise movements and faster movements, just with the inconvenience of the button being held down. The only other problem is that it's not very tactile. You don't get a feel for like moving a wheel and kind of feeling that. You're just holding down a button and guessing. At least you know what direction it went. Along the same lines as the button is the keyboard. By default, or at least on mine, it's assigned to the numpad. So key, 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 key. You can see the trim wheels moving, same as the button. down the other way. And again, if you hold it, then after a delay, to make sure you really meant to hold it, then it goes faster. This hold inside the sim, if for a keyboard, it could just be using the keyboard's repeat, but it's not. You could change your repeat rate in Windows and it wouldn't affect this. It's really inside the sim that it says, okay, you're holding it. I'm going to pretend that you're hitting it. I think it's like 30 times a second. Not sure. Same for the button. You're holding it down inside the sim. It's suddenly going 30 times a second, which is way faster than you could do it if you were trying to, just spam the button. So that's your digital modes, your button or keyboard modes for controlling the trim wheel. What about controlling it with an axis? I don't have an analog trim wheel. When you read analog trim wheel, that's what it means, is it maps to an axis. You remember that the ones that we looked at here a minute ago were actually mapping to buttons, up and down button. But you could also use an analog trim wheel. I don't have one. I could use my steering wheel from my racing sim, but it's not on the desk here. So I'm going to simulate an analog trim wheel with my mixture control on my quadrant. So you can see I've assigned, well, it's assigned to mixture, but let's go ahead and load up my analog trim test. And now my trim here, you can see that, pretend I'm kind of moving a wheel, right? You can see this axis is moving. You're thinking, well, this is fantastic. This is the way to do it. Trim wheel from Flight Velocity, analog wheel. They figured out that people were frustrated with the sensitivity of it. Either it moved too fast or too slow for them, depending upon their game they're playing. So they actually have a pro version that has a knob to adjust how much it moves as you move the wheel. I think this is the perfect solution. It has, you could go slow and easy, or you can go fast. Only drawback is maybe if, depending on how many turns your wheel has, if you're trying to do a fine adjustment, really fine, it's a little bit difficult if it moves too much when you move the wheel. But you can adjust this. It is an axis, so you can use the sensitivity to adjust it, which is what I did. But I said this is the perfect solution. Why don't we all do it? Why did I get a different trim wheel, which I'll show you in a second? What do the people with the Bravo trim wheel do? It's not analog. Are they out of luck because it doesn't work? Why would anyone use a digital trim wheel? Well, the answer is autopilot, which I rarely use, but when I was picking a trim wheel, I finally decided to go with a digital one because I didn't want this frustrating incompatibility, quote unquote, incompatibility with autopilot. So let's say that you are using your analog trim wheel. Watch the trim wheel here. And you've trimmed for climb. So you're putting nose up, right, as you climb away from your departure. And then you get to the altitude you want to cruise at for a while. You turn on autopilot. And then you stay there and you even leave autopilot on as you start to descend. And it's adjusting the trim. You will see in the sim and in a real airplane, if you have a trim wheel, that the autopilot will adjust the trim to do what it needs to do, and the wheel will actually move. So if you imagine that this is the autopilot doing this now, the autopilot is moving. So it goes to level flight, let's say, and then you start to descend. And you've got it, the autopilot has it like perfectly trimmed, perfectly trimmed for descent. And you turn off the autopilot, and now you're going to do manual trim control again. And it's just barely off. You just want to change it a little bit. Now watch the indicator here. I'm going to reach over to my pretend analog trim wheel, and I'm barely going to touch it. Just barely. Boom. All of a sudden, there I am back where I was before at nose up. Boom. Just like that. Everything was perfect. But as soon as I touched this, it said, oh, now you're going to use this. Therefore, this is down here in this position. That means nose up. So that's the disadvantage to an analog trim wheel. If you never use autopilot, then I guess get an analog trim wheel. Or if you're fine with the fact that you just touch it and it reacts like that, violent reaction, and so then you correct for it, right? You're like, oh no, I wanted nose down, right? So you correct for it, depending on the sensitivity of your analog trim wheel and how much you have to move it to do that. So that's why everybody doesn't use an analog trim wheel. I picked a digital one because I didn't want to deal with that. And now we're going to get into the disadvantages of the digital one and a way that I've come up with to try to get around that, at least in Microsoft Flight Simulator 2020, but I think it'll apply to others, and at least for the trim wheel I have. What about a digital trim wheel? What does it do? How does it do it? What are its advantages and disadvantages? This is the trim wheel I picked. I mentioned that I wanted a digital one. This is a digital one. It's from a company called Desktop Aviator, and it's just a trim wheel. The reason I picked this is because I decided, right or wrong, that I wanted digital. And also it has expandability. The microcontroller board that controls it is right on the back here, and it's got headers, pins, that are available for adding your own switches or potentiometers for digital and analog controls. And I like that idea. I didn't want to spend too much. It was $79 plus shipping. It's a small company, so they have to charge for shipping. The things I don't like about it, since I've pretty much done a review already, are, to get ahead of myself here a little bit, you can watch as I move it, see how the trim wheel moves. But notice the trim wheel goes move, 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 pause, move, 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 pause, move, 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 pause. That's annoying once you notice it, because when you're flying and you're trying to do a small adjustment, if you're in one of those pauses, nothing happens. And the other thing that is frustrating, and this is kind of the point of this video, is that it only does about 6 button presses, 6 pulses on a button per second. That's the fastest you can get it to go. The microcontroller inside limits it. Why is it limited? Because if you send it too fast to the sim will ignore the button presses or just see them as one button press. And that's pretty fatal. So it's better to be too slow than too fast. Anyway, here's the point. I'm moving this trim wheel, and if I move it like this fast, which seems reasonable, look how the trim wheel in the game kind of crawls along. Look how long it takes me to move, let's say, this knurl down to here. And it really doesn't matter if I go faster. In fact, in some ways that does the opposite of help. And that was a lot of motion to get a little movement. And you'll notice that this thing didn't even hardly budge. That's kind of the problem we have. The other possibility for people with other wheels is that they have the advantage of sending much higher number of pulses per second, but the game will only see them up to a certain rate. And if it sends it too fast, it's almost like you're not moving it at all. So that's the two things that could go wrong with your digital trim wheel. One is that it sends pulses quite slowly, and it just takes a lot of movement to get it to move. The other is that it sends pulses very rapidly based on a little bit of movement, and that'd be great for moving it quickly, but if they're too rapid, then it won't work, basically. And I don't know which of those two problems other digital trim wheels have. Digital trim wheels that I know of are this one, the one on the Honeycomb Bravo, the Logitech multi-panel trim wheel, and I'm sure there's plenty of others. What is it actually doing when you use it? Because I had talked about how you can use button, keyboard, or an axis. Well, this clearly isn't the keyboard, and it's not an analog axis. It is, in fact, doing button presses. That's what it does. So here in my assignments, I roll this down. Every time it hits the button, you see it go. So you can also see that thing where I said about the pauses. Da-da-da, pause, da-da-da, pause. But each one of those flashes is a button press. That's not 30 times a second, which is what happens, I think, inside the game when you hold down a button. Once it realizes you're holding it down, I think it does 30 times a second. That's why if you look back here in the game, if I hold down a button, look at it take off once it realizes I'm holding it, as opposed to this, trying to get it to go the same amount, right? This is what's driving people crazy. On the other hand, the advantage of this is that, I mean, not over a button, but the advantage over an analog wheel or using the mouse is that when you want to just move it one button press, you can do that. So now what do? You're trying to use your trim wheel to get to nose up, and you are trying to fly, and you are sitting here turning this wheel like crazy, and it feels like you're never going to get there. And the faster you go, it might even work worse. What do? There are some paid or payware programs that I don't have. FSU IPC has a way to go in and say, hey, every time you see this button press, I want you to press it 5 times or whatever. Spad.next, I guess is how you say it, is another program that has a way to deal with this. Both of them are cost money. The FSU IPC has a free version for interfacing, but if you need to use these features, it costs money, about $24 or $25, I think. And I just was not in the mood to spend more money after I just tried to find an affordable trim wheel and bought my yoke and stuff. So I wanted to come up with a way using only freeware programs, since I couldn't figure out a way in hardware, and that wouldn't have helped anybody else anyway. I wanted to come up with a way using freeware programs to speed up the action in the game, but also keep the precision. If in FSU IPC, if you say every time you see a button press, do 5 button presses, well, then you have no option to not do 5 button presses. So you're trying to move it one little thing, and it's doing a bigger movement every time. I wanted a way to have the best of both. And I think I figured it out using a program called VJOY, which is a virtual joystick, meaning it's like another controller on your control inputs, and a program called Joystick Gremlin, which is just a lot of things you can do with your remapping your joystick stuff. So let's get into it. The first program you want to get is, as I said, called VJOY. I will put a link down below. I don't want to go into all the details of how to install a program. The website that VJOY was originally from got hacked, apparently. So now the safe place to get it, I think, is through GitHub. I'll put a link below. Of course, anytime you're getting a program from a website that doesn't get much downloads, your browser protection may say it's an unsafe website. It's up to you to decide if that's true or not. If it's from a place that I trust that a lot of people use, I go ahead and get it anyway. But it never hurts to scan the install file, the exe that you get before you actually install it. Scan that with your virus scanner. You don't have to do anything once you install VJOY. I think it might open the configure VJOY devices window by default once it's installed, but you don't have to do anything. It's enabled by default, and this just allows you to decide how many buttons it has and stuff. But I didn't need to worry about any of that. I'm just default's fine for me, and I do want it enabled. However, you do have this configure VJOY available. But like I said, you install it, you forget it, mostly. So that's the first program. The other program is called Joystick Gremlin. And this is going to be the important part of the work we do. And I will put a link for it also. So if you have questions, let me know in the comments. I'll try to figure it out. Okay, so now let's fix our problem. I'm going to start with a new blank profile. Seems a little daunting at first. It's pretty simple. What you do is you find the thing that controls that your trim wheel comes in on. So I have a dedicated trim wheel. So mine's on this trim wheel tab. Maybe it's part of your Bravo quadrant or your Logitech multi-panel. It'll show up here and you can figure out which one it is. Then you need to know which buttons are actually used by the moving the trim wheel. Notice that it highlights which button is activating. So that's great. Now, what are we going to do? Like I said, it's a little daunting at first. It seems like way too many options, but I've boiled it down to a relatively simple thing. What we want to do is we want to detect a double tap. The reason we want to do this is we don't want to just remap this button press to a virtual joystick. That wouldn't do any good. We just have the same thing. And what we could do is just remap it and tell it to repeat it. That would speed it up. If that's all you want to do, great. It just means that anytime you get a button press on this, it's going to do the repeats on the virtual one, whether you want them or not. So kind of like the FSU IPC thing, you're going to get multiple button presses for one button press here. I wanted the best of both worlds, like I said. So I said, you know what? I'm going to use this built-in double tap to say, it's not click add, so I'm on button 3, to say that if I see 2 button presses in less than a certain amount of time, that must mean that I am a double tap is what they call it. But what it means to me is that I'm trying to move that wheel. I'm not just creaking along slowly. I'm really trying to get some movement. And therefore, I can have a different action depending on whether it's going super slow, in which case I do nothing other than pass the button press through, or if it's going fast, then I can multiply the speed and make it move faster in the game. So that's what we do here. And I'll talk about this double tap delay in a bit. It's important. So on a single tap, we're not going to do anything. In our flight sim controls, we're going to continue to use the trim wheel input as an input. So we don't need to map it to a virtual joystick input. When we get one button press on this, it's going to do one button press in the game. So if it's a single tap, don't do anything. If it's a double tap, we want to get a little fancy here and do what's called a macro. I'm going to add that. Macro is a sequence of commands that happen when it sees what it thinks is a double tap. So what we're going to do is add a new action. And we're going to say that we're waiting for VJOY button 1 to be pressed. I'm sorry, not waiting for. No, not waiting for. Our action is that when we see a button press on this, we're going to button press the virtual joystick button 1. So that's going to be our nose down. Then what we're going to do is add a second action, and this is going to be a pause for 0.02 seconds, 20 milliseconds. Okay, that's important too. I'll talk about that in a minute. Then we're going to, again, VJOY button 1, make sure it's the same button. We're going to release it. So far, what we've done is we said when the trim wheel button 3 inputs one button press, then we want to create one 20 millisecond long button press on the virtual joystick. Not helping us. Ah, yes. But then we say count. And we say, not only do we want you to do that, but every 20 milliseconds thereafter, we want you to do this whole thing again. And we want you to do it 8 times. I can tell you could play with this. You will anyway, if you're a curious person. You'll play with this and see what happens with a different delay and a different count. This to me was a good compromise between functional, meaning I'm not trying to do it too fast, and response and accelerated, meaning that now we get 8 button presses for one movement of the wheel. That's accelerated, but also not laggy, meaning you stop moving the wheel and the in-game wheel just keeps going as these other button presses catch up. It's a compromise between all those things. So now I've done this. This is all I had to do. It's now saved, and I'm going to, for the down direction, I'm going to save this as trim wheel accelerator 2D demo. Now, why do I have a 2D and a VR? It's a sad story that I'll explain in a bit. So here we're doing 2D demo. Now, we go in the game, we go to first of all, we'll go like, oh, this is so exciting. Let me see it work. My button down is going to be accelerated now. No, it's not. Why not? Well, could be a couple of reasons. And these are all things you want to get used to checking. You go to controls. You say, my trim wheel is set up. So that's why it's moving. Oh, my virtual joystick. Well, it's set up too. I set up my VJOY device, which will show up as one of your controls once you have VJOY installed. And I told it, button 1 on VJOY is nose down. And you're like, why isn't it working? What'd I do wrong over here? Let's go look at our inputs and make sure the input's working. So you say, trim wheel is the input, VJOY is the output from the macro. I'm going to move it. I'm getting button. Why am I not getting anything on the virtual joystick? It's not only not accelerating, it's not doing anything. Because you haven't not enabled you haven't activated. So activate. And here under options, I have it set to activate when I launch Joystick Gremlin. It activates the currently loaded profile. You can also have Joystick Gremlin start with Windows so that basically when you reboot your computer, you don't have to do anything. This is now running, it's activated, and you don't have to get into the game and then go, I forgot to activate. I couldn't get that to work. When I tried to start it with Windows, it complained of a missing batch file or something. So I just have to deal with it. And it seems like anytime you connect or disconnect a controller that this gets deactivated. So this is all new, just in the last couple of days. I'm trying to get used to it and find a more convenient way. But that was our problem in this example, was we didn't have it activated. Now let's go look at the inputs. And this is a great debugging tool when you're trying to get this work and try new things. Now watch what happens. If I go nose up, because we haven't done anything with nose up yet. It's just doing that. Now watch what happens when I go nose down. You see that? I'm doing nose down, and not only is the virtual joystick flashing much quicker, but it's flashing a bunch. So I get a couple of movements on the top one, the trim wheel button, and a bunch on the bottom one, which is the virtual joystick. Like, okay, now we're talking. So now we go in here and we look at the virtual joystick. Again, nose up, nothing because we haven't done it. Nose down, look at it, flashing like crazy. It's just nailing that button. So now let's see if we've made any difference. This is the whole point, or at least half the point. Let's do nose up first, which we haven't fixed yet. And to get that knurl from there down to there, we're going. God, I'm gonna have to edit this part of the video out because it takes so long. All right. Now, what about nose down? That's where we made a change. Let's see what happens. Look at that. Now, what about this whole thing about double tap and all of that? Why'd I do that? If we look at our input viewer, we want to see the desired behavior, which is that if we move nose down rapidly, that the virtual joystick amplifies the speed. And if we move nose down slowly, then we just get those single button presses. And the virtual joystick generally doesn't do it. Sometimes you get a little excited, you move it a little fast, and all of a sudden you get the virtual joystick beeping too. And of course on the nose up, we haven't done anything yet. So that's doing exactly what we want. We've accelerated it when we want it accelerated, but we've kept the precision when we want it precision. Okay. And so again, in the game, this is wonderful because now we've got, whoops. Oh yeah. That's another one you got to watch out for. I've been messing around here. I moved it all the way to nose down so it wasn't working anymore. So now here I am using the mouse, which I can do because I'm not actually trying to fly right now. Anyway, nose down, you can see that we've got so much faster movement than we had before. But when we want very slight movement, just tweaking it to get that last little bit, we've got it. I'm super happy with that. I have flown with this like this, and I love it. So now all we have to do in Joystick Gremlin, there's got to be a way to copy this macro and copy it over to another button. Can't figure it out. So I'm going to just go ahead and go here, say double tap, add, do nothing for single. For this guy, we're going to do a macro, going to add it. We're going to say, first thing we do is we're going, when we see button 4, we're going to push virtual joystick button 2. Make sure you pick a new button. It's going to get pressed. Then we're going to delay for 20 milliseconds. Then we're going to go to button 2, not 1. We've already got, you can have all kinds of fun getting that messed up, and make sure you release it, which I forgot to do, and so it just pushes and never releases. So you'll know what happened there. And that is the macro, and then we say we're going to count at, or we're going to repeat at 20 milliseconds per 0.02 seconds for a count of 8. And now we have set up both macro or button 3 and button 4. When you make a change like that, my find is deactivate, save it. I'm still using my 2D demo here. Save it, activate it. And then of course you don't need to do that once you're done editing. So now, nose down, it's fast, zoom. It's also precise when we want it to be. Nose up, zoom. I mean, relatively zoom, right? And then when it's precise, there we go. this is what I wanted. I think that if your trim wheel is putting pulses out too quickly, I think this will fix that too. But I don't have a way to test it. What about the double tap delay? This could be a problem for implementing this, just like for other digital trim wheels beside mine. Mine, I know 6 taps a second is as fast as it can go. So like 160 milliseconds per tap. So if you see 2 taps in 200 milliseconds, then you must be going just about as fast as it can go. And therefore, that means you're in a hurry. Therefore, you do the macro. Yay. But if I lower this to 100 milliseconds, I'm saying in order for it to be called a double tap, I have to see 2 taps in 100 milliseconds. That's kind of impossible for this trim wheel, and which is frustrating, but it may actually be saving the day for me. So now I enable this, and I move my trim wheel. I'm moving. I've got that activated, and I am not getting any virtual joystick amplification. I'm not getting anything. Why? Because it's never seeing a double tap, because I'm requiring it to be too fast to count as a double tap. On the other hand, let's say that I'm not really thinking. This thing defaults to, I think it defaults to 500 milliseconds, but let's just get really crazy. Let's say it's sitting at 1 second, right? If you see 2 taps in 1 second, that means you're double tap. Now it's going to be really hard to not see it as a double tap. And so now, even when you're trying to be precise, oops, I forgot. Deactivate, reactivate when I made that change. So now I'm trying to be precise, and I keep getting the amplified virtual joy button, right? I'm like, I just want to move it a little bit. Oh, man. So you need to mess with this to see what works for you by using that input viewer and see that you can get acceleration when you want it and not when you don't. However, if your wheel puts them out so fast that even at 100 milliseconds, you always see a double tap, then there's nothing you can do about this, because that's the resolution of this thing is 100 millisecond resolution. I think I or someone could make another plugin for this. It's really powerful to do a custom double tap or quadruple tap. Let's say probably best would be to detect a quadruple tap within a certain amount of time. Then it could work. But I don't know how to do that yet. So what you would end up with in the case of your wheel putting out faster pulses, which is a good thing, you probably don't need this if your wheel's putting out faster pulses. You probably don't need any of this because it travels fast enough for you, automatically. But if you were trying to utilize this stuff anyway, like for instance, like I said, if your wheel's putting out too fast, then maybe this method will in fact allow the virtual joystick to slow it down and start working again. The point is that just forget about the whole detecting it as a single or a double. Basically, anytime you move it, it's going to be called a double tap, and it's going to accelerate it, even though that might actually be decelerating if that's what you need. So then you just give up the precise movement, perhaps, but that's the same as what you get with the FSU IPC workaround. So this will still work, and it's free. If you only fly in 2D and you're bored with this video, then you're done. You don't need to know anything else. Just go do it, and hopefully you'll be happy. But if you use VR, this is the one that I was flying with, and I developed it all in 2D. So we've got this basically two twists of the wheel. And I went into VR, didn't work. I will demonstrate. And I've got I didn't change anything. All I did was go into VR. That's all I did. And now we're going to see how long it takes us to move this knurl up to here. How many times? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. This is not working. What is going on? What happened to my, you're like, oh, do I not have the, no, I have it activated and it's all right. What is going on? Well, as it turns out, and I posted a bug on this in the forums, in VR, the game samples the buttons at half the speed, about, that it does in 2D. So we are now feeding it virtual button presses too quickly, and it's missing them. And this is very disappointing. But I discovered it, and I was quite depressed because I fly in VR, and I finally just settled on, you know what, maybe there's another way to do this, but for now, I'm just going to double the delay. So 40 milliseconds. This stays the same because you're still detecting a double tap at the same rate, which I haven't talked about yet, how we set that. Need to do that. But you are holding it down for 40 instead of 20, and you're doing 40 more milliseconds before you repeat it. And so this means that the lag is notably worse. Notice that it's moving the right amount. It just takes its time getting there. So there's more lag when you stop moving. I haven't figured out a better way. And like I said, when I'm in a hurry to move it, all I really care is about getting close. And then we still have the very fine movement to adjust it, for precision. Maybe somebody will come up with another way around it. I reported it as a bug. The held down button rate is less. So in other words, if you hold a button down in VR, the trim wheel moves slower than it does in 2D. How's that for confusing when you've gotten used to how much you need to hold it, and then you switch back into VR and now your trim doesn't seem to be responding? So you might think about that next time you're wondering what the heck. But I like this solution for me. It gives me the speed, gives me the precision, solves my digital wheel. I think I've addressed everything, if not mentioned in the comments. This has gone on long enough. I hope it helps. I really hope it helps. I think a lot of people will be happy if their trim wheel works and they can use their trim wheel on their Bravo or their Logitech multi-panel or their desktop aviator panel or whatever. Have fun. Good flying. See you later.